what were the results of your model? I know there's a lot of them, so you can take your time to break it all down.
Yeah. It's not so bad actually. So we had about 36 or 32 constructs that went in. I forget exactly.
I believe it was 32.
Okay. Um, on average, like this approach selected like 10, but then we kind of whittled it down through various phases. And so really there's two models that we develop. One which is the difference score, so the difference between like my ratings of my group, whatever that is, and my ratings of an outgroup, whatever that is. And then there's just like the straight up ratings of the outgroup. And we have slightly different results based on these two. So the main ingredients are contact, which is a major thing that's been studied in the field, threat, and identification. That's the model that explains the difference score. It's really just those three ingredients, though there's like a few different measures of threat in there. And then just the ratings of the outgroup alone is contact, threat, and agreeableness. So the two models are mostly the same except for the identification and the agreeableness part.
Okay. And so contact can be understood as like proximity versus distance.
People have studied a lot of different ways, and the reason, and in fact, the first model has two different measures of contact because classically it's been studied or quantified a lot of ways. I think the survivors that came out of our modeling approach was just like the number of outgroup friends you have, and then the rated like positivity of the contact you have. So it's kind of like a quality and a quantity measure that both survived. And this is maybe the longest, or like maybe the construct that has like the most evidence of support in all the intergroup literature. There's like a big meta-analysis which finds like a negative relationship of like negative 0.21 Pettigrew and Trop, and that it's coincidence, but it's exactly the coefficient that we landed on in our model as well. So just as people have more contact with members of the outgroup, their prejudice goes down.
Okay. And threat can be understood as symbolic, so so like how you perceive it, and then physical or actual threat.
Yeah, so just like contact, threat is also a super old construct in psychology that you've probably learned about in my class, because like some of the earliest theories were about like realistic threat or relative deprivation. So like my group has some stuff. No, your group has some stuff. My group is missing some stuff. Prejudice as a result of that, and conflict happens.
Right.
Threat's been measured a few different ways, and we had a few different measures in the paper. The two that survived was what will be called symbolic threat, and this is the idea that your values threaten my values. So it's not about like actual physical conflict. It's just that like you believe in something that I don't, and that threatens my worldview. And then we had a generalized measure that we took from another paper, which is a bit of like what's called realistic and symbolic, probably, which just says it's a single item, and it's like people from X group pose problems for people like me. Or it's 3 items, but that's like the gist of all of that.
Right.
And so that might it might overlap a little bit with that symbolic element, but it might also be like they're getting jobs that I need, and so that's like a realistic threat. Or I want to go home, and they like pose like a risk of like mugging me or something like that, and that'd be a realistic threat as well.
Right. And so there's like you can see that there's like an overlap between contact and threat where there's some distance, right?
Some distance. What do you mean exactly?
So like, if like the getting job on, it's like if you see from like afar that a certain out group is getting more employment and more like, I guess, wealth opportunities to get an income, you're not really going to go closer to those people, right?
Oh, right.
That's what I mean. Like so like you can see like these are mutually like irreducible, but there's like some overlap going back and forth that kind of they kind of like feed back to each other.
Right. I mean, I think that's why kind of they've ended up in the model together, is that they both predict prejudice, but they do have some sort of independent contribution. But surely these things are related to each other as well, and some sort of like calls a way that we don't understand yet. So if you're really threatened by a group, you're probably way less likely to like seek them out and be friends with them. So probably contact would be lower.
Right.
Or the reverse. I'm sure it's bidirectional. Like if you just are kind of forced into more contact with group X through maybe work or shared social group, your threat goes down because you just don't literally view them as outgroup as you might have in the first place.
Right. And identification, is that like self-identity with the specific group?
Yeah, so this is actually our strongest predictor in the model, which I was a little surprised by in this first model. And it's just like, so say, for example, we're measuring attitudes between like white people would be the in-group and black people would be the out-group. To the extent that like being white is like a really big part of my identity, that was the biggest predictor of more negative attitudes towards black people.
Okay.
So we're not totally sure, but this might be driven more by like an in-group love rather than an out-group hate aspect, because this is like a difference score, right? So you might rate your, like, a difference of 1 might be like, I rate my own group a 7, which is really high, and then the out group a 6, which is also pretty high. But there's a difference. But it could also be, I rate my in group like a 1 and the out group like a 0. Those would kind of have the same value. So it does hinge on like how much you care about yourself. So it's possible that these like strong identifiers just rate their in group like really high.
Okay.
And they're not like hating the out group, but they just don't like them as much as they love their in group.
Okay. And is there any way to kind of improve the, I guess, like test batteries to kind of capture those differences?
No, it's kind of like, it's more of like a conceptual choice. We can dig into it, and there's like a whole, Marilyn Brewer has a whole lot of work looking at out-group hate versus in-group love. And some whole areas of work, like my PhD advisor, like aversive racism framework, is kind of like a guiding philosophy is that like most people don't hate out-groups. They just like their in-groups more.
Right.
And that prejudice for most people in like your day-to-day experiences is more driven by like an indifference or a slight less caring for the out-group rather than like hatred.
Right.
And I think that, and this is not even trying to explain like more extreme negative behaviors like actual like warfare or hate crimes or things like that. This is just like sitting next to somebody on the bus or slightly differential hiring rates.
Right.
That's like the framework. So there are whole areas that kind of looked at the in-group love versus out-group hate. We're purposely kind of trying to avoid that. That's what the difference score does, is it kind of naturally adjusts for someone who just like likes everybody. Rates the in-group a 7 and the out-group a 6 versus hates everybody. Rates like the in-group a -3, but the out-group a -4. That would be equated because we just care about like differential liking by that definition.
Okay. And just to clarify, well, some of this sounds like stereotyping. Are stereotypes or stereotyping and prejudice on the same continuum, or are they kind of different?
Right. So we cut out stereotyping from the model on purpose. So prejudice is kind of associations with a group with like positivity or negativity, period. Stereotypes are associations as well, but it'd be more about like anything like dogs being dogs and fur is an association or a stereotype that we might have. And so even though by definition they are different things, we think, and what's common in the field is that like the things that groups are associated with in and of themselves are can be more positive and negative. So for example, if you took like, I don't know, African American people and jazz, people have a relatively positive association with jazz. That's just like a stereotype. But then crime would be another association that's there. But crime is not like a neutral construct or attitude object. It's like negative. And like the dumb example that we make in the papers, if we associate like vampires with evil, like technically that's a stereotype. But evil is something that almost everybody feels bad about. So that would kind of like, we think that like as the things that groups are associated with become more negative, it just becomes more and more similar to prejudice. So a lot of people have kind of like tried to study attitudes towards different groups with stereotypical associations with things like intelligence or warmth, or like Muslim people with terrorism. These are like heavily loaded associations that we think just kind of become equivalent to prejudice.
Okay.
So we purposely didn't include them because we didn't want to like, if any of our predictors that went into the piranha fish tank essentially are prejudice, it kind of like, it ruins the whole model because it undermines all the relationships that would come out statistically.
And in your model, did you include, or at least try and include, any like emotional or affective components?
No, not at all, because we think emotion, it's for the same reason. We think that like anger and disgust are part of prejudice, like the dependent variable here. So to put them in the IV, we'd get strong relationships, but it's just because we're like using prejudice to predict prejudice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
So we do test later on how well our model can predict like intergroup attitudes. And it kind of breaks down actually. So we think that like anger from one group towards another, or disgust from one group towards another, must just have additional predictors that we're not capturing in our model.
Okay. So then I guess to kind of conceptualize your model, is it more of a cognitive thing that you're kind of constructing?
I mean, it wasn't on purpose, but that's partly how. Actually, no, I would say. So all the things we put into the pot, some of those things were more cognitive leaning, like personality constructs. But a lot of the survivors, like contact, that's just like experiences that people have in their day. Feelings of threat, that's not particularly cognitive either. But identification is certainly like a personality characteristic, even agreeableness, which came out in the other model. So I think we gave a lot of these like different subdomains an equal opportunity by putting them into the model together. But they didn't all come out equally.
Okay.
And part of that might just be the causes, but part of that is like some of these things are more difficult to measure, period. And if we have bad measures of it as a field, then it's unlikely to survive the fish tank, if that makes sense.
Right. Another thing is, to clarify, you were measuring purely attitudes. You're not really measuring behavior as a result of those attitudes, right?
Prejudice as the dependent variable is just, differential liking, no behavior at all. Right.
Do you want to like venture into that territory eventually of how like one leads to the other, not as a cause, but as like a correlation, or more of like is there some type of predicting variable here?
No, definitely. That's kind of going back to is prejudice the point, where I don't care about prejudice in and of itself. We study that as a field because we think it matters. But what's difficult with behavior is that, so if we were in in a different, say like 5 years down the line, I'm developing this sort of model for like a behavior, like a discriminatory behavior. I think the problem is that like this discriminatory behavior from that discriminatory behavior, say like sitting close to somebody on a bus, or differential hiring decisions, they probably just have like, prejudice is presumably a common thread through both of those, but there's probably just like a lot of other factors that are also going on. And it just becomes really hard to apply a model uniquely across a lot of them. So people try to study discrimination in a more abstract way with these like economic games that presumably would apply across a lot of scenarios. But it's harder. But eventually, absolutely, that's where I want to go, is to see, okay, if we're doing a pretty good job with measuring this prejudice construct, how much does it actually predict behavior?